very glad that NHM and the government of Kerala has decided to take the fourth edition or the fourth version of the guideline and to actually look at it bit by bit so that it becomes clearer. It's always good to discuss a guideline or a protocol, because then when it is discussed, it becomes more user friendly. When you read it alone, sometimes you have doubts. Am I doing the right thing? Is this the way I've understood it correctly? But when you listen to somebody thrashing out the finer details, it makes more sense. There are just two corrections. Divya, I was not responsible only for the writing of this. The Kerala Federation, we as a group wrote it together. But yes, I was very much interested and very much in it as well. So a lot of these of the fourth edition, where the guidelines in pregnancy are concerned, is drawn from what we felt, what we have seen, and drawn from scientific data as well. The second wave, I put this as COVID-19 and pregnancy riding the second wave because it was so different from the first. Also because I was also in two centers for the first and the second. The first one I was in Kollam, and the second I got transferred back to Trivandrum. And I find that the first one we had it so easy. The women were much more asymptomatic. Actually, we were going and finding out the COVID status prior to admission or prior to cesarean sections. This time we have a lot more younger women, lot more pregnant women than we had last time. Low risk, last time we thought only the high risk subjects would be affected, and very many of them were either diabetic or obese or had some problems. But now a whole lot of low risk antenatal women also got affected. There is no tracing now because the question doesn't arise because there are such large numbers. And there's really any significance to hotspot and containment zones because most of them come from these areas. Infectivity is much, much more. You find a lot of home clusters and a large number of severe cases in category C, and therefore more oxygen use and asymptomatic cases are much less. I'll just run through the basics just once again so that we all understand that what the symptoms could be. Very many still, I would say still are asymptomatic. But compared to the last time round, yes, we have more symptoms this time. Mostly ILI-like symptoms, that's influenza-like illness. So you have coryza, you have sneezing, you have a sore throat, you have kind of a deep-rooted throat pain, you have fever, fatigue, headache, there's sometimes a cough, very characteristically a loss of smell, sometimes a loss of taste, diarrhea, because the COVID acts through these AC inhibitors, and a lot of these receptors are present on the gut as well. So you have diarrhea also as a symptom. Actually, when the very, very, very first edition, sometime I think in February 2020 or March 2020 came out, we all thought diarrhea. What is this diarrhea? Have they misspelled dyspnea as diarrhea? But then we realized no, diarrhea was a symptom of a respiratory illness. So very protean in its manifestation this can be. And when we wrote this, we categorized, in the non-pregnant population, you have an A, B, and a C. But we thought, and rightly ICMR did that, they put all the pregnancies into B because they felt that pregnancy was an immunocompromised state. And therefore, even if they're asymptomatic, they cannot be in A. They form a higher risk group, and therefore they should be in C. But when we looked at it, all the ones in B are not the same. So we thought we'd divide it into two, B1 and B2. Actually, this was Lalidambika Madam's idea from Alleppey. We tried very many permutations and combinations. B1 and B2 made a lot of sense. So B1 was the low risk asymptomatic pregnant positive. That is, she really has no risk at all. She's just pregnant and she's asymptomatic. We find her out because she's coming to the hospital for admission and therefore we are testing, or she forms a part of a home cluster or something like that, and therefore she falls into B1. In B2, there are two kinds. Either they can be symptomatic or they can be women with comorbidities. Now you will ask me, why is it that we should stress on the pregnant women with a comorbidity? At the time of writing of this guideline, We only thought that yes, the comorbidities should deserve a lot more attention. As Srimari Madam would always say, comorbidities have a problem. In pregnancy, we need to be more careful. So that's all we thought about. But today we know that there are some interventions like probably remdesivir or monoclonal antibody, though not typically given in pregnancy as a routine. Once you have severe comorbidities and they have mild symptoms, to prevent the onset of worsening of symptoms and prevent further replication of the virus, you can give them. So it makes a whole lot of sense to put symptomatic pregnant women or pregnant women, even if they are asymptomatic, they have comorbidities like diabetes, hypertension, renal disease, sickle cell anemias, heart disease, obesity, all of them will go into B2. And C is the really sick mother, the one who is dyspneic, who has hypertension, who needs ventilation, who's on oxygen. She will all of them will fall into category C. And yes, it is good to categorize, but it just doesn't mean that she remains in one category. The B1 can become B2 very fast. The B2 can become C in hours. And therefore, it is important to recategorize and check the category very often. Once they are in the home isolation front, maybe every day they do their pulse oximetry, they look at their walk test. But once they are in hospital, especially if they are B2 or category C, at least every 12 hours, that is twice a day. So we spoke a lot of symptoms. We spoke about upper respiratory symptoms, but there are some things which are red flag, which really you need to be worried about, which you should be careful about. So breathless, cyanosed, she has chest pain, her SpO2 is less than 90. We teach that or we practice less than 94. But less than 90 is really severe and it's a red flag. Respiratory rate, we teach it becomes more than 24, you should be worried. But when it becomes more than 30, it is really a red flag sign. And pulse rate, when it rises more than 110, you're worried. But when it's more than 125, it's really a red flag. So really, this goes to tell you that in pregnancy, there is a certain physiology that operates where there is an inherent tachycardia. And therefore, because of the increase in blood volume, there's an increase in the heart rate, all this contributes. And therefore, pulse rates are on the higher side. 90, 100 in pregnancy, you may just ignore, but once it reaches 110 and definitely more than 125. And if she has any form of bronchopneumonia. Now, while we are on this, it's also good to say that a lot of tachycardia and a lot of sinus tachycardia that we see in pregnancy, even though we get the cardiologist to see them, very many of them are COVID related and they subside on their own. But we need to evaluate them. So it is not enough to say that, okay, this woman has these because of COVID, let me just keep her in home isolation. I think if there is any deviation from the norm, they have to be brought in and they have to be checked. So those were the red flag signs when we are really bad. So when do we worry? Before they really become red flag, when they were persistent fever and cough. See, fever in COVID can be quite prolonged in some instances. Cough can also be prolonged. Outside pregnancy, they say 5 days, but we tend to start getting worried when it doesn't abate in about 3 days, maybe on the outside 5 days. Or the patient reports with breathlessness. And I always try right from the beginning, it makes a lot of sense that not necessarily to only look for the SpO2, but actually to look for the work of breathing. Very many of these women will breathe very shallowly. They want to conserve their energy, so they breathe shallowly, and you'll find that their accessory muscles, the sternomastoids, are actually working. Or there is a respiratory indrawing. It's difficult to find an indrawing in a pregnant woman, but let me tell you that pregnancy per se, the women are abdominothoracic breathers normally. And then when their work of breathing increases, they become thoraco-abdominal. So you should look for that. Are they really distressed? Is their SpO2 less than 94? Is their respiratory rate more than 24? Is their pulse rate more than 110? Even things like excessive malaise, fatigue, somnolence. See, something is happening in their system. Either their inflammatory markers are really increasing, which is causing a lot of inflammatory damage, and that's why they have malaise, fatigue, and somnolence. You must be very, very careful. And in these, somnolence is very important. You usually talk about increased sleepiness, lethargy, and even small TIA kind of things in the older people, but the youngsters can have it as well. Pregnancy can have it as well. So you must be careful. So the next question is, can all these pregnant women be managed at home? Yes, if she's category B1, she's totally asymptomatic, she was discovered for some other reason, yes, but there are some criteria which I'll come to later. Category B2, that is, she has mild symptoms, but she may not have comorbidities. If she has a comorbidity, yes, a visit to at least a CFLTC is a must, but mild symptoms can be managed at home. It is important that the patient is compliant and that she understands that, yes, if I feel breathless, if I'm in any way uncomfortable, I must report. She must have a telemedicine facility or contact with some PHC, whatever it is, a healthcare facility over the phone. And she must isolate in a well-ventilated room. That facility must be available for her. If she's just asymptomatic, she doesn't need any treatment. She doesn't need too many investigations, but she must self-monitor with an oximeter. This is something that I think is very important. You cannot wait for them to get breathless and then come. We wasted a lot of time. They need to monitor their, to pick up the happy hypoxia, to monitor with the oximeter at home and do the 6-minute walk test. This is just a way of looking at it. It's good for them to chart out these kind of things. Write the date, the time, what was her temperature, single breath count. That is basically you take a maximum inhalation and then starting without exhaling, start counting 1, 2, 3, 4 in a particular 2 counts per second cadence. And usually they can count up to 50. This is a very arbitrary with a capital A system. But it is always better to use the pulse oximeter. And ask them to do the 6-minute walk test. If they're in a room, they can walk around the room, check their pulse ox readings before, check it after the 6-minute walk test, and there should not be a fall of more than 3%. So this is actually somebody who's very proud of. This is one of the patients, educated, yes, but even then, even the others are very tech savvy. This is somebody who sent these kind of data. It was right in the beginning when we were worried about all this. So beautifully done after walk test. If this is the kind of compliance we need, if you have a compliance like this, you will be safe. The pregnant women will be safe. And yes, education is important, but our women are basically educated. It just requires them to be told that this kind of thing needs to be done. They need to monitor their pulse and tell them the pulse and the oximeter readings come on the oximeter. And therefore, remember, one is the pulse oximeter, the SpO2, and the other is the pulse rate. Tell them to report the two separately. Otherwise, they'll always report. They'll say, my SpO2 reading is 82. And then you get so worried, you bring them in, they've looked only at their pulse rate. So this is important. And if this kind of a person can report like this, our pregnant women will be fine. So you can also classify disease into mild, moderate, and severe. Mild is, there's absolutely no problem. Her respiratory rate is less than 24, SpO2 is more than 94, and she's asymptomatic. That's our category B1. But the moderate, she has some amount of dyspnea, but between 24 to 29 respiratory rate, SpO2 is between 91 to 94. She's on room air, she's fairly okay. She may be having a mild fever or a cough. Fever and cough is a little worrying, but it doesn't mean. The other thing I'd like to say is, just because she has a fever and just because she has a cough, don't go into a string of investigations and start remdesivir and start this. You can wait for that 3 days, but she must be monitored, provided she does not have dyspnea and she does not have hypoxia and her pulse rate is normal. Yes, she has severe dyspnea, she has hypoxia, respiratory, the breathing is more than 30 breaths per minute, SpO2 is less than 90, pulse rate is more than 125, she is a severe disease. So what happens when they have mild symptoms? coughs are treated like any other cough. She may be pregnant, but you really don't need to start a lot of things, provided she has only cough and she does not have high risk factors. She can have a meter dose inhalation of budesonide, 800 microgram twice daily. That's very good if the cough is persisting. And another thing which is a must is most women will take the paracetamol SOS. That's not correct. They must take it 6th-hourly. See, when we treat fevers outside of COVID, we like to know the kind of fever spike. Is it a high spiky kind of fever? Is it long periods of no fever in between? Here we don't want to know the kind of fever. We don't want her to have fever. Fever means inflammatory markers are going to increase. We don't want all that. So you will give her the paracetamol 6th-hourly for fever, or you give the round-the-clock medication. Remember, azithromycin, oseltamivir is of no proven benefit when she's asymptomatic. All your chloroquine, ivermectin, vitamin C, what all we tried, all that is of no use. Yes, she can drink plenty of warm fluids. See, some of them have a little bit of body pain, myositis. They can rest, but it doesn't mean she needs to have bed rest. She can walk around, and most importantly, personal hygiene, daily bath, all that must be adhered to. What is the testing policy? Now, the testing policy in pregnancy is definitely test. So if there are symptoms in pregnancy, better to test. But sometimes women, not now our numbers, I don't know, come down. We don't have that many category C patients, but if there are long queues for testing and testing is difficult, especially in a cluster, sometimes we tell them just home isolate for that 10 days. See if you have any symptoms, but make sure that you look at your pulse rate, that you look for any symptoms, and look at your oximeter readings. So what are the laboratory runs you will do, and when will you do it? So routinely you can ask for a complete blood count in RFT, LFT, sugars, electrolytes, ECG, CRP. This is on a basic minimum. Your D-dimer, ferritin, LDH, TROP-I, TROP-D is important, not in category B1 when they have symptoms, or if they have unrelenting fever or they are dyspneic. Yes, you will at least on a basic minimum do a D-dimer and a ferritin. But again, as I said, only if they're category B2 with more than mild symptoms or no symptoms, you don't need to do. But if she has a comorbidity, you may do it. And report any red flag signs. Do you need to do an X-ray for all pregnant women? No. See, sometimes I fear that we are over investigating. And I would say that COVID has made us very, I don't know whether I should use the word complacent or whether I should be a very easy on writing an X-ray in pregnancy. If you asked me 2 years ago, I would think 100 times before I wrote an X-ray. Another thing that we're very easy with prescribing is heparin. We would think 100 times earlier about antenatal heparin, but now we're very comfortable with giving the heparin. But at the same time, X-ray may not be needed at all. It's not contraindicated. A single X-ray exposure is fine. Then you can do it with a lead apron, perfectly all right. But yes, when she has symptoms which are either moderate or severe, you do not need to do it in the asymptomatic pregnant woman who has no other comorbidities. Remember, HRCT lungs is not required. It is not required at all as a routine for either pregnancy or outside pregnancy. But if required, if she is not responding, you want to know the extent of the pneumonia, or you feel that it is COVID, but you're not able to get a positive result, all these are some of the indications for you to do the HRCT. How will you interpret the lab run? CRP is usually less than 5. But I always will exercise some degree of caution when you look at a CRP. CRP is an acute phase reactant. Suppose I have an allergy, suppose something has bitten me, or I have, I'm generally not well, my rheumatoid arthritis is acting up, whatever, I may have something, my CRP will rise. It's like an ESR. So CRPs of 7, because I say it's less than 5, that doesn't mean a CRP of 10 is very bad. Yes, when it reaches 7500, I'm worried. But D-dimer, again, this is something when before COVID, we taught that D-dimers in pregnancy are really not very useful, and therefore don't do it as a marker of DIC. But today, in COVID, that has taught us, the RCOG has really set out nomograms for the first trimester, second trimester, and third trimester. Just remember 1.2, 3.2, 3.3. So 1.2 is the upper limit for the first trimester, 3.2 is the cutoff for the second trimester, and 3.3 is the cutoff for the third trimester. Cutoff in the sense, usually it falls in less than this category. If more than that, you may think of either accelerating your steroid or accelerating your heparin. In more instances than this, you may also think that you will ask for additional inflammatory markers like ferritin, LDH, or any other thing. But ferritin usually is less than 60. When it creeps above 100, closing on 300, you're worried. LDH greater than 400, you're worried. The NLR, that is the neutrophil lymphocyte ratio, and the ALCs, these are both very significant. I've given you the nomograms there, but I would like to tell you something very significant. You must interpret this on a naive patient. That is a woman who has not got any other form of treatment, especially steroids, because steroids will increase the total counts and the NLRs will change. Therefore, in a woman who has not got steroids, yes, NLRs and ALCs are significant. So when you start thinking, diagnosis is extremely easy. We do RT-PCRs left, right, and center. I'm not going into the diagnosis, but what really works in pregnancy? It's just these 4 things: steroids, oxygen, anticoagulants, and proning. Nothing else. Now we will talk a little bit about remdesivir, about monoclonal antibodies, a little bit about tocilizumab. All this, yes, we will talk about. But by and large, I sometimes feel that is to satisfy our souls. What really works is this much, at least as far as studies go. We'll come to all this, but remember the favipiravir is out, the ivermectin is out, 2-deoxyglucose, we really have no experience with it, but monoclonal antibody, remdesivir and tocilizumab, I will come separately. So who really gets, we said soap, that is the steroid, the anticoagulants, the oxygen, and the proning. So who gets the anticoagulant? Let's reach one conclusion that all admitted patients, if you are admitting a pregnancy per se is something that is more prone to DVT, it's a hypercoagulable state. It satisfies, if you go back to pathology, it satisfies all the criteria of the Virtuose trial. So even outside COVID, that is, even if she didn't have COVID, pregnancy, the RCOG really tells you that admitted patients, they don't admit for any rhyme or reason. No, they admit because there, you must remember, their medical care is insurance driven. You really can't admit for no rhyme or reason. But there, once they admit, it is for a particular reason. Those women are really antenatally, if they're admitted, they are severe due to some other reason, and they will get heparin even prior to COVID. So we know that COVID has a very strong procoagulant mechanism, which is probably the damage that it does to the lungs, and therefore all admitted patients will receive low molecular weight heparin. Now, what we need to understand, what is the dose you will give, which kind of heparin you will give. Is it a low dose protocol, or is it a prophylactic protocol, or will you give a therapeutic protocol? Now, let's think of the times we had before COVID, and how did we give heparin? If at all it was required, we used to score these patients. I'm not going into the score, but let's say a woman who's had a previous thromboembolism, she's had an unprovoked not pregnancy specific, unprovoked, an arterial thrombus. All these are very high risk, and they will start getting heparin from the first trimester itself. So those kind of women will still, and they will have higher doses, depending on what kind of, whether the APLA positive, did she have any hereditary thrombophilia. So depending on her score, these are the women who will continue to have heparin irrespective of COVID, and they may have a higher dose. So here we will score their VTE risk and measure their weight as well. Preferably a first trimester, but anyway, a weight is measured. And we tend to give, if she's of average weight, less than 90 kgs, or if she's in the third trimester and less than 90, 0.4 is okay. Now, when she crosses 90 kg and is less than 130 kg, we think of 0.6 ml or 4 mg and 6. So 0.4 and 0.6 ml is what we give as a low dose and a therapeutic protocol. Now, very close, let's say she's in the third trimester, she comes at 38 weeks, she has all the symptoms. Yes, we are going to plan delivery. Probably delivery is better and then start. Or if you're waiting for some more time, 34 weeks you're waiting, then you may want to give her unfractionated heparin, because the half-life of unfractionated heparin is very much shorter, 4 to 6 hours. If she gets into labor, you just need to wait for 4 to 6 hours and then she's fine. Whereas the low molecular weight has a longer half-life, so you should be a little bit more worried. And you continue to give it postnatally as well for about 10 days, sometimes even longer if she has been in category C and very severe. Now, what is the role? We don't have much experience with oral anticoagulants in pregnancy, but there have been, and we have started giving oral anticoagulants like rivaroxaban outside pregnancy or in the postnatal period. 10 mg OD for 10 days can also be given. So this is the kind of picture you will give with thromboprophylaxis. So the low molecular weight, you have a therapeutic dose and a thromboprophylaxis dose. The first column has the prophylaxis. This is taken from the guideline and it is taken from outside pregnancy, but can be extrapolated to pregnancy as well. So you give 40 mg, which is 0.4 ml. So this is when her BMI is less than, if she's more than 40 or if she's more than 120, this is given as either 40 mg 12th hourly or 60 mg OD. So if it's a weight-based protocol. If she has no other risks, it is 0.4 mg or 40 mg, 0.4 ml or 40 mg. Intermediate doses, suppose you find the risk is increasing, it can go up to 1 mg per kg every 24 hours or once a day. So the therapeutic will be the same 1 mg per kg, but every 12 hours or twice a day. So remember, the low molecular weight heparin is given for all pregnant women who are admitted, irrespective of whether they have symptoms or not. Suppose she's admitted for delivery and she's COVID positive. If you're going to wait for a week, give it to her for that week. Then stop it for 12 hours and then deliver her. Or give her unfractionated heparin, wait for 6 hours and then deliver her. Yeah. The same thing for unfractionated heparin. The prophylactic dose will be 5,000 units 12th hourly or BD. The intermediate dose, when her weight is higher, will be 5,000 units 8th hourly or 7,500 units 12th hourly. Yes, this 80 units per kg bolus followed by 18 units per kg as an infusion is all when you have therapeutic doses, especially when you're suspecting a thromboembolism. These are the high dose IV protocols. But just remember that all of them require a steroid. So this is the same thing I said. Once a day, 0.4 ml or 40 mg is what is done if she's of average weight and does not have any high-risk VTE score. 5,000 units 12th hourly is given if she's again low risk. These are all the oral anticoagulants, out of which fondaparinux and rivaroxaban are the ones that we have some data about. And rivaroxaban 10 mg OD after delivery. And this is a subcutaneous injection, again OD for 10 days. Deltaparin is another form of low molecular weight heparin. This is almost the same. So after discharge, see, always there is this thing, you've started her on heparin, then you stopped it, you delivered her, she's COVID positive and you have restarted it. Then the third day, she's fine. She's either had a normal delivery, mother and baby are okay by God's grace, or if she's had a cesarean section by day 5, she's ready to go. Your protocol says 10 days. So should you keep her in the hospital for 10 days? Very many of these patients are uncomfortable. Let's face it, they are uncomfortable in a public care facility because there is a lot of overcrowding. They would like to go home and be in their home environment. Not at all a problem. They can go home, but again, you score their VTE score and decide whether they need prophylactic doses or therapeutic doses, and preferably tell them to take it at home for 10 days. There, in the low risk woman, there may be a role to start her on 150 milligrams of aspirin and send her home, but the mechanism of action of the two are completely different. There are no studies that will support aspirin, but yes, we do it at times. But there is an improved VTE score. I'm not going into the details of this, but just for you to understand, VTE scoring is there in pregnancy. You have to score where the patient decide, does she need a prophylactic dose, does she need a therapeutic dose. So again, when we look at this, what really is beneficial to the woman, there is a large study which has come out in the New England Journal of Medicine, which says that yes, the low dose prophylaxis may be enough, provided you've scored them and weighed them and done everything. But they have very less risk. They don't have a big risk of bleeding with the low dose. But when you go into the intermediate and the high dose protocols, the risk of bleeding may be there, but very many of them will require it if they have a higher score. So don't hesitate to give larger doses. The next thing we said that works is steroid as part of the SOAP, SOAP, S was steroid. So how, do you give them to all patients? No. So whom do you give the steroid to? When the woman is breathless, when she has a fall in the oxygen saturation less than 94%, or she has a positive walk test, or she's got evidence of bronchopneumonia, you felt she was breathless, you ask for an X-ray, there are patches in the lungs, peripheral zone, round patches, half rounds are there, ground glass opacities are there, yes, you will give her steroid. Or you find that, you know, for some reason she's tired, her fever is not abating, and her inflammatory markers are creeping up, doubling, tripling, yes, you will give her steroids. And maybe in some instances, not the standard dose, you will increase the dose of steroids as well. So these are some of the steroid triggers, and also not just the SpO2, again, measure the work of breathing. Look at her accessory muscles and see if she's comfortable. Now, which steroid do I give? Dexamethasone, remember, there are studies which will tell you dexamethasone is good. Dexamethasone crosses the process, it is for lung maturity as far as we are concerned. So if this is the studies that have been quoted have all been done outside of pregnancy. When we look at it in pregnancy, dexamethasone is given for lung maturity. So you give it 12th hourly, you give it for 4 doses, and 24 to 48 hours after that, your baby's lungs are fairly mature if you are thinking of delivering. After you've given it for that 48 hours, then you switch to methylprednisolone, IV or orally. Usually we give it IV. You give, for a woman who's mildly dyspneic, who doesn't have a great work of breathing, 0.5 to 1 mg per kg is enough. Roughly about 40 mg. OD can be given IV. And this is continued for about 5 to 10 days. Orally is also the same amount, 40 mg a day. Remember, it can go up to 60, it can go up to 80, you can go up even to 120, depending on whether her oxygen requirement is increasing, whether she's becoming more breathless, is her accessory muscles working more, are her pro-inflammatory markers increasing. In these situations, yes, you can step up the doses of the steroid. But always, always, always remember, capital A, that when you're on steroids, please look carefully at diabetes. Pregnancy itself is a diabetogenic state. It is pro-diabetic because of the hormones in pregnancy, especially human placental lactogen. When you add steroids, especially in larger doses, you've crept from 40 to 80 to 120, she will throw up high sugars. Eventually, your pregnancy morbidity will be because of uncontrolled sugars. So you may, or most often than not, will have to start insulin. So when she's on steroid, look at sugars very carefully and start insulin if required. Don't hesitate. Now, the other thing, because proning is difficult in pregnancy, something about the when and how of oxygen. So when do we start this oxygen? Once desaturation has occurred, her SpO2 is falling, she's having accessory muscles that are working, you've started her on oxygen, and you need to increase the flow rate based on response, but just don't stick to the oxygen all the time. You need to go from one modality to the other. I'll come to it. And engage also, once she is all right, engage in an active weaning policy. Right? So how can we deliver this oxygen? How much of oxygen? How to do it? I'll go about it very much in brief because I'm sure Anil has done this with you separately. So I'll just go through it in brief. Yes, you can start off with a nasal cannula. And remember, in the nasal cannula or the simple face mask, they will say you can give up to 4 to 6 liters, 10 liters. Just 50% of that will be the actual amount that you're going, because there'll be a lot of loss. Whereas the non-rebreathable masks, the NRM masks, these will deliver a little bit more, up to 10 liters, but not many of us have access to it. It's not very expensive. It can be procured. If you can use it, it's the perfect device, because as you inhale, the exhalation valve, there are valves on this mask that actually closes. There's not so much of aerosol generation, and the amount of oxygen reaches in a concentrated way to about 10 liters. And when she exhales, you'll find that the valve, the exhalation valve opens, whereas this valve will close, and therefore a lot of the expired air is sent out as well. So this is a very good device. It can be used, and can be used when the amount of oxygen you need is up to 10 liters. But when we are at this, we also actually, right in the beginning, we were giving oxygen and waiting and waiting and waiting, and then hoping that we would wean fast. But then we understood that, for the oxygen to reach the circulation, for it to mix with the blood and for it to act effectively, does not require days and on end. It requires only minutes. So Dr. Anil Satyadas will actually tell you, for half an hour, if you're really particular, 45 minutes to 1 hour, she should be doing better with one of these things. If she's not, then you need to switch to NIV. And before you switch to NIV, or as you're switching to a non-invasive ventilation, you need to look at her ABG as well, most of the time. There is a high flow device, which is a device that is actually strapped on. It has a harness that straps itself onto the face. It's an air entrapment device, and therefore it delivers very large amounts of oxygen, up to 60 liters. You must understand that you can say 60, you can say 10. How much of it will actually reach with the without the high flow nasal device is very much less. So you need to be careful. More than that, when you're giving oxygen and she is not getting better, you need to do something. You need to step up your steroids. You would have already started remdesivir if she's been early in the course of the disease. The other things really will not work once you need to step up your oxygen care device. NIV, yes, once nasal oxygen is not working, you know that the PaO2 by FiO2, when it is 150 to 200, yes, the NIV will work. You're very comfortable when it is above 250, but once it starts falling to about 150 to 200, you need to use the NIV. And NIV is, again, I always say, when the woman has that NIV mask onto her, sometimes when they come back for checkup, it's very easy to remember the patient, because she'll have a nice mark here. It's not a very easy device to wear. When they're breathless and they're pregnant and there's a uterus as well that is hitching against the diaphragm, it's extremely difficult. And you need to be careful not to put them on NIV for very long periods of time. At the same time, if they're getting better, you need to wean actively. But if they are not improving, if their ABGs are worsening, their PaO2s are falling less than 80, less than 70, the P by F, that is the PaO2 by FiO2 is falling to less than 150, you need to think of mechanical ventilation. Now, very often the problem with mechanical ventilation is accessibility. You need to have an ICU. The gynecologist cannot I would say it needs an intensive care specialist and a team of anesthetists to manage this. It needs nursing care, on more than anything else, nursing care on a one-to-one basis. And that's probably the reason why we all hesitate, especially in large ICUs, in situations when you may not be able to provide that one-to-one care, we worry about mechanical ventilation. But if the P by F really falls to less than 150, you should be thinking of mechanical ventilation. And once your NIV is not, once the woman gets onto an NIV, doesn't mean you bring the baby out. If the baby is mature and your baby's survival is okay, yes, bring the baby out. But if she is needing mechanical ventilation, irrespective of gestational age, you will bring the baby out, because the the enlarged uterus itself will cause problems with mechanical ventilation and problems with oxygen saturation as well. Now, not just the oxygen part of it and the ventilation part of it, we have these drugs. We need to know when to give it, how to give it, and I would say more than anything else, how justly to give it. So it just doesn't mean that because there's a patient, she is acutely, you give remdesivir, then you give tocilizumab, then you decide, no, I'm going to give monoclonal antibody. No, that's not the way. So you need to know which drug is good for what person. Now, let me tell you, all these three, that is remdesivir, tocilizumab, and monoclonal antibody, are really not prescribed for pregnant women. So you need to think, do I need to give it? If I need to give it, I need to consult with the ID specialist, or I need to have a medical institutional board, with the board that you have at your institute to endorse this as well. And it is on compassionate grounds. So you need to inform the patient and take a consent as well. This is something that sometimes we do miss, and it is unforgivable, because later on something happens, we will be in soup. So you need to get a consent for all these three categories of drugs. Remember, remdesivir, we spoke about it a lot, to an extent to which it was not really available freely for use. But remember, there is not much change in mortality. She is not going to survive just because you gave her remdesivir. That is study proven. But there is definitely a shorter and a much more comfortable journey to recovery. You can't give it after she's been at home for 10 days and then come with symptoms. So you need to give it very early in the stage of the disease. That is exactly why the B1, B2 categories were made separately, so that the B2, if they are symptomatic or if they have medical morbidities, they go to a facility and the facility decides, does she need any other viral replication medication. So it needs to be given early. This inhibits viral replication. It is definitely given when she requires supplemental oxygen, but definitely not when it really does not work when you go switch from your ordinary mask into high flow nasal oxygen, NIV, or mechanical ventilation. The remdesivir may not act. How do you give it? It is given 200 milligram on day 1, 100 milligram for the next 4 days. So is it enough to give it on day up for 5 days? Most of the time, yes. But in some very rare circumstances, when you see some kind of improvement or you see no improvement at all, sometimes you may need to extend the duration of treatment to 10 days. But remember, RFT and creatinine clearance have to be normal. It is excreted through the kidneys, so you must be careful. This is a drug that now we have started to use. We have, I would say, I'm not proud to say, but that we have some experience with. It is the antibody against the IL-6. So IL-6 is an inflammatory marker that can wreak havoc. It can cause a lot. It can wreak havoc in the lungs. So does that mean I need to have IL-6 values before I start tocilizumab? No. But what do studies tell me? It reduces the odds of death by 13%. It reduces the odds of requiring mechanical ventilation also by 28%. So you give it at 8 mg per kg IV. Maximum usually is 400. 400 is the usual that we give, 800 milligram otherwise as a single dose. Very rarely do we repeat it, and that too with consultation by the ID specialist. Sometimes in about 8 or 12 hours, we may repeat another one. Remember, it's it's an immunosuppressant. So you must be very careful while giving it. It just cannot, okay, she's less than 10 days of symptoms, let me just give her toss. So that's not the way to do it. Tocilizumab is given to women after making sure that they have sufficient body weight, that they don't have tuberculosis, they don't have HIV, things that can flare up. Also, remember that it brings down total counts. It's a real immunosuppressant. So, when your viral marker, your immunomarkers are very high, yes, tocilizumab will work, but it will also bring down total counts and all quite close. You need to monitor your total counts after that, and also probably prevent secondary infection with an efficient antibiotic. So that is tocilizumab. And here, yes, these are all there in the guideline, but you must be careful about total counts. And when your absolute neutrophil count is more than 1,000, you're fine. When it is between 500 to 1,000, you will probably hold it. You'll wait for some time. And even when the pregnancies are there, you will be a little bit, just a minute, let me just take the clicker. Yeah, so when the 500, when your absolute neutrophil count is less than, is between 500 to 1,000, you usually, we prefer it when it is more than 1,000, and we will withhold if it is less than 500, definitely. But between 500 to 1,000, we usually ask for a consultation to see whether it can be given or not. You can give half the dose in such situations. Instead of giving 8 mg per kg, we can give 4 mg. And as the patient improves, we can increase it to 8 mg per kg. This is also the same thing that we may do in pregnancy. But in pregnancy, when it is less than 500, we will not give it. And even platelet counts, we are happy when it is above 50,000, above 1 lakh. When it is between 50 to 1, it's the same thing. We think of giving half the dose, or we may hold if she's better. If it is less than 50,000, we will not give tocilizumab. Again, liver enzymes are a problem with tocilizumab. So if it is 1 to 3 times the normal, you can give it, but you will give it at half the dose at 4 mg, or you will withhold a drug till the ALT and the AST is normalized. But yes, if it is more than 3 to 5 times the limit, you will withhold the drug. And if it is more than 5 times, we don't give it at all. This is your monoclonal antibody. It's a combination of two, the casirivimab and the imdivimab. Both these 600 is given, 2 separate vials is taken, is given as a single dose. Yes, again in pregnancy with prior approval of an institutional medical board. It's a very expensive drug. Once a single vial is broken, 2 people can use it. It is, you'll see the contraindications, you will see pregnancy there. But yes, once the disease has progressed to a stage when you need oxygen, there is no point giving monoclonal antibody. So monoclonal antibodies are really given when the disease is very early in its stage, and when you have a woman who has severe comorbidities, who you feel will benefit and will prevent her from going into severe problems. So if she is more severe in the course of disease, there's no point in giving it. So if she's on oxygen, you will not give it. Suppose she's on oxygen therapy for some other condition also, you will not, or if it is more than 10 days. These are the high-risk individuals who may benefit from this cocktail because it is 2 drugs that are given together. Obesity, chronic disease, chronic kidney disease, over gestational diabetes per se, I personally believe, I'm not really sure, but diabetes, when your HbA1c is very high, over diabetes with vasculopathy, yes, chronic liver disease, rheumatoid arthritis, all your immunocompromised conditions, or if she's receiving some immunosuppressive treatment like chloroquine, hydroxychloroquine, azathioprine, any of those, cardiovascular, respiratory disease that are chronic, all these you will give it. So then we come to, do we need to, when do we terminate pregnancies? If she is asymptomatic, it is purely on obstetric. I think it's high time we started thinking about that. It is on obstetric grounds. But yes, the ones who have recovered from COVID and who come to your general pool, I guess 39 weeks is time enough to induce them, because there is a certain degree of growth restriction in these. There may be an increased incidence of meconium, but it does not mean cesarean section. You will induce them at 39. But the asymptomatic woman who has no problems at all and who you have probably put in the hospital because she's term. Yes, by about 38 weeks, you can start inducing. It does not mean cesarean section. But when you're considering she's going worse, you've given her nasal oxygen, you've given her NIV, she may not yet be term, you're considering invasive ventilation, or she's not improving on the NIV, then you may need, and there the decision is made fast. You need to take the baby out, you may need to ventilate, it's often a cesarean section. But in the other instances, may not always be required. And if she is, let's say 36 weeks and she's getting better, she really has no problems, wait till the condition improves and then embark on an induction of labor. There is definitely an increase in meconium and an increase in FGR in these pregnancies. So after recovery, it's good to look at an ultrasound, look for the biophysical profile, look for the growth parameters, and then decide accordingly. Once they're in home quarantine, they really don't need to retest. Just the total 17 days from first symptom, which we all know, and then there is no testing required. But if she's in the hospital, especially category C, we do it after 14 days. Vaccination is the talk of the day. We all know it's approved for both pregnancy and breastfeeding. We must encourage our patients to take it. I think knowledge is power in such situations. They must be told that yes, vaccination doesn't mean that you will not get COVID after that. But even if you get it, from what we have seen and what we have learned from our experience and from studies both within India and abroad, we find that the severity of disease is much less. And also the big problem now is this thrombocytopenia syndrome, especially with the Covishield. And we need to tell them that yes, as with all vaccinations, there are problems. These are reported as well. So 1 in 1 lakh can have problems, but getting COVID may be much more serious. And that's exactly the reason why there is on a consent basis, it was done in Kerala. And they'll ask you, can I have it if I have diabetes? Yes, you must. If you have hypertension, yes, you must. Everything is a yes for pregnancy vaccination. There are no actual contraindications except if she's had an allergy or an anaphylaxis to the first dose of the vaccine or to any other vaccine. But if she has allergies or any other food allergy or dust allergy, better to take it at a higher center, but definitely can be taken. So what kind of advice will you give your pregnant women other than the vaccine? Definitely prevention is better than cure. You need to do your social distancing. You need to wear masks and sanitization. And every woman must be told to calculate your safety index. I think we also need to do it. Do you go out and ever? Some people have this habit, as they talk, they lower their mask. So when you go out, never lower your mask. Do you wash when you come back home? See, pregnant women also work. It's not possible for them to be at home all the time. They must not attend large gatherings, family functions, and preferably if they have very many people coming in at home or other people from home are going out to work, either they do a reverse quarantine or they wear a mask at home. The 4 C's of, I think this is my last slide, the 4 C's of COVID management. Yes, counseling. They must be told to be positive. That this can be, I won't say can be treated, that you must prevent it. Coordinate the network. Coordinating and managing a network is very important, and that's exactly why the state, the gynecologists in the state have to work as one. Whether it is private, whether you're in the health services, you're in the DME, we should work as one. Prevention, so caution is very important, and definitely cure in the form of treatment. Thank you very much.
Yes, madam. The first question is it necessary to start heparin even if the D-dimer values are normal? That is the first
that's question. A good question. Once a patient is hospitalized, I think it's better to start heparin.
Is rivaroxaban safe in lactation?
There are trials that have said that it can be given under guarded circumstances, but yes, it is given.
Is there a need to wait for the acute phase of viremia to pass in doing an elective CS at 38 weeks, 5 to 7 days from positivity?
Yeah, 5 to 7 days from positivity, you really don't need to, it should be on obstetric grounds. That is, suppose you feel that, yes, you need to do a cesarean section for some reason at 38 weeks, you should not compromise and wait for the COVID to become negative. But just because she's COVID negative, she's asymptomatic, she has absolutely no other problems, you don't need to be in a hurry to do it at 38 weeks, you can do it at 39 as well.
Should you give oseltamivir to COVID-19 pregnant women with fever and severe sore throat?
No, actually, the oseltamivir really doesn't work in COVID-19. We were giving it in the first wave in 2020. We did give it, but now no, we don't give it. No. I think we gave it because we never knew what else to do, and we tended to draw on our experience with H1N1, and therefore we gave it in the first wave. Once we have known that it really doesn't work, and yes, we do have some alternative, however good or bad, like remdesivir, we have really stopped giving oseltamivir. But that doesn't mean we give remdesivir to all.
But there is a small difference in steroids. Actually, in JIPMA, we are still giving, dexamethasone even for pregnant women for COVID. Why do you say that prednisolone should be given and not steroid?
When they looked at the studies on DEXA were all done outside pregnancy. None of it was done in pregnancy. Then if you looked at the potency of methyl of all the steroids, methylprednisolone, dexamethasone, methylprednisolone fares better, and therefore DEXA is given because it crosses the placenta. It is good to act on the type 2 pneumocytes and incite lung maturity. But when we are giving it for the sake of the maternal lungs, we'd rather give methylpred. Do you give, Lata? Do you give DEXA? I know there are a lot of people who give DEXA, but we have been giving methylpred.
No, I agree that methylprednisolone is good because it doesn't cross placental barrier. It's not a problem. I have two more questions. Can I ask you?
Sure.
One thing is about, I would say it's a comment about tocilizumab. We are not giving remdesivir and all these things. Only thing is tocilizumab, as you rightly said, I think it is just before the changeover from NIV to, ventilation. Giving it after or much before, it doesn't matter at all. It does.
Yes.
And another thing is, second wave, we knew there were a lot of maternal deaths. How did you cope? And we ourselves had, first wave we hardly had, but second wave we did lose quite a few mothers. So, though every action was, in fact, we even had to terminate pregnancy because of ventilation and all that.
Absolutely.
But all those who went on ventilation never came back. It's like any other, what I discussed with my friends in Europe or UK, they have a different scenario. They could bring out a lot of mothers. I don't know whether it's the same thing here. Where are we differing from them?
See, that's why, Lata, we have the same experience. We had only 7 deaths, the whole of Kerala state, due to COVID in the first wave. As of now, till now, we've had about 52 deaths due to COVID with the second wave. Now, when we looked at them and analyzed them, even across disciplines, whether it is the anesthesia people, the intensivists, or the gynecologists, everybody believes heart of heart. It's what I call an honest, wrong belief. It's honest because this is what we have seen. It is wrong because the textbooks and the journals are telling you otherwise. Once she's on a mechanical ventilation, she just doesn't come back. So we push patients, we push them on NIV, and we push and we push. We try and avoid that mechanical ventilation. But very often, whether we are right or wrong, when the NIV is not working, we bring the baby out. We don't think of gestational age. We just bring the baby out. And I personally believe that the reason why the mechanical ventilation is not working are two. This is a very personal opinion. I don't know whether I'm right. is one, because we have waited for a little too
Exactly.
long on
Exactly.
NIV to switch them to mechanical. Once their lungs are half eaten,
Yeah.
mechanical ventilation will not work. The second thing I believe is that we have a large, in Trivandrum, our hospital caters to a very large population, and we only once mechanically ventilated do we shift them to the general side. Till then, it's the gynecologists who look after them, which I think is a lovely situation, because I think nobody feels for the pregnancies as much as gynecologists do. Mechanical ventilation, if you look at you can look at some private data from across the country and outside. The ones they mechanically ventilate quite early. Piley sir is the best one to speak about this. He will give you data about his patients who he mechanically ventilates quite early, and they come out quite well. Maybe
That's
we are
what
a little too late in doing it.
Maybe even I feel the same, but I know there have been debates about this, and even when they have done early ventilation, also we have lost patients. So it's really, situation which we're not able to understand, but unfortunately, we've lost mothers. Thanks, Sangeeta.
Is Covaxin given in pregnancy? What about those who conceive 2 weeks after taking Covaxin?
No harm. No harm. The thing is, I don't know whether to say no harm. Actually, I have been teaching to say I don't know. Not to say no harm, because it's a correct thing to do. I think it's time we are all honest. There's no point saying, no, I have so much of experience. No, I don't have any experience. I don't know how this works.
Risk versus benefit.
Yeah, risk versus benefit, if you look at it, yes, Covaxin, Covishield, it's better to take the vaccine than to get COVID and get into an ICU. So we prefer them to take the vaccine. But I'm not really sure. What we say is take the vaccine that you can get. If at that time it's Covaxin, take it. If it's Covishield, take it.
Does oseltamivir need to be stopped if LFT gets elevated? Already the question is not applicable. Since
Oseltamivir, I have also written oseltamivir right in the beginning, but now no.
What precautions to be taken in a patient who has just recovered from COVID, especially term patient?
Yeah, so a term patient, she's recovered, you send her back home first. Don't keep her unnecessarily in the hospital. Let her see her family. Let her be all right. Tell her to come back for a review. You must do an ultrasound. Look at the Leica volume. Look at the growth. If required, do an ultrasound with Doppler to tell you how the blood flow in the umbilicals and the uterine and the cerebral vasculature is. If everything is normal, she has no medical disorders, bring the baby out at 39 weeks by an efficient induction, not by cesarean section. But at the same time, if you feel that she has some medical comorbidities, follow the guidelines for termination based on. So if she's hypertensive, 37 weeks. If she's diabetic on insulin, 38 weeks. But the only thing I would, I don't know, this is also something what should I say, the ARRIVE trial tells you that 39 weeks is okay. I'm not comfortable with pushing the COVID positives to 40 weeks. All the other patients, I have no problem. The ones who are COVID positive, I'd rather bring them out at 39. By an efficient induction, just because she's COVID positive doesn't mean you do a cesarean section. No.
Can we advise vaccination to an antenatal with subchorionic bleed in ultrasound?
Yeah, you can.
Post-COVID patients in labor, what all things to be taken care of?
Depending if they have IUGR, intensive monitoring. Stop your post-COVID, she's not going to be on heparin. So as labor as normal as is possible.
Minimum gap COVID positivity and second dose of vaccine, that's again not pertaining to the
pregnancy. The pregnancy vaccination will follow the same rules as the non-pregnancy. So it's the same waiting window.
3 months is what we have already read. Can we advise vaccination in first trimester threatened abortion with subchorionic bleed in USG again?
Yes, you can.
Pregnant women with dog bite, can we give IDRV and COVID vaccine?
I have no experience, but I would say it can be.
One among it is emergency and the other one is a planned thing. So,
Yeah.
Lata madam is having some opinion.
Yeah,
Please,
I
ma'am,
know
go
there
ahead.
was one. No. There is a patient who had not the COVID vaccine, but after it's a neurotropic virus, and the rabies virus, the anti-rabies vaccine. They make you wait for 2-3 weeks and then take the yes. We had a doctor who took it, not pregnant but outside pregnancy. She had to wait for 3 weeks and then take the COVID vaccine.
So COVID vaccine is not an emergency one. The other one, we have to take.
Always wait for 2-3 weeks and then
There's
take
no
it.
harm.
If you've taken
No, I just go with what Sangeeta has told. If people are worried, there's no emergency to take COVID, and you can always take after 2 weeks. Even for the routine vaccination, what we see, tetanus toxoid, we cannot stop. TD and whatever. So if we do tell them take in both, either of the hand, one hand this and one hand that. But if they are very worried, you can always take after 2 weeks. So that should be okay, and there's not emergency to take a COVID vaccine. That's the same thing.
I'm the one who put up the question like, can we give IDRV and corona vaccine together? So like somebody suggested that after the 2 weeks, actually IDRV is 4 doses actually. Till 28 days we have to give. So it's from the last dose or from which dose is like this 2 week?
See,
the last one.
So
anything is
corona
after the last
vaccine,
dose.
it comes to them, it's also a risk, isn't it? Like,
See, that's what you have to weigh the risks again, benefits. No one has that much experience to say no or no, do not. So ideally, if you go by our ICMR guidelines, this is you can give the vaccines. Only thing is you can give it do 2 different hands or whatever. That's all.
Another problem is TDVAC. Like people can take TDVAC.
Definitely give together, no problem. If patients are so worried about it,
they do recommend that it's given on separate arms.
That's it. Yeah.
There is, I think, a very pertinent question, which really I see so many referrals into SAT hospital saying that she's had COVID. Now she's post-COVID, 14 days, but her D-dimer is 3.2, so she's being referred. So some people has asked a question, should D-dimer be done in a post-COVID patient and for how long? No. Don't do the D-dimer post-COVID, and please don't refer to SAT hospital because her D-dimer is high. It really doesn't. See, D-dimer in pregnancy itself is always a question. Now, we have a norm that says that, yes, because it is pregnancy and it is COVID and such a thrombogenic state, yes, and the pathogenesis of COVID is because of the thrombogenesis in the pulmonary vasculature, we are looking at D-dimers. But now that issue is gone. She has become a RAT negative. Her 17 days is over. We have given her 10 days of whatever, anticoagulant, steroid, whatever or heparin, whatever you've given her. Please don't do her D-dimer after that. I always remember what one of my professors used to say. If you send an investigation, you must know how to act on it. Otherwise, don't send it.
Yes. Is there any role for low molecular weight heparin in COVID positive pregnant ladies with normal D-dimer levels?
If they are home isolated, they do not require heparin at all. But once admitted, yes, they require.
It is the severity of pneumonia and how badly the lung is affected determine the prognosis. That's actually a statement or?
No, actually, you look at it, the amount of affection of the lung will prognosticate, if you think of it logically, that is probably how the patient will behave. But yes, you've done one X-ray and it says a few opacities, peripherally, ground glass opacities, and she's becoming worse. Her oxygen requirements are going up. She's not working on the on her NIV, and you are thinking of mechanical ventilation. Let me ask you a very sensible question. I'll ask it in the reverse direction. What will you gain by finding out it's quite likely her lungs are full of ground glass opacities? What extra thing will you gain by knowing it is there? Are you going to do anything else? No. Are you going to give her Torsoli? You're not going to give her. Are you going to give her remdesivir? Yes, you may give her mechanical ventilation. That is decided not by the status of the lung, but rather on her performance status with the oxygen. So really doing a HRCT there is of no use at all. But if her lungs are bad, she's not going to respond well to mechanical ventilation as well.